Yes, Lilian, you can see your screen.
Okay. Thank you very much. Without much further ado, we're going to learn together about data ethics, governance, and protection. And just outline of what we're going to cover is you're going to look briefly into the expected learning outcomes, the context, and then the introduction to data ethics and governance, the introduction to data protection, and then methods of data acquisition, and then we can have the discussions or the Q and answer sessions. So we anticipate that upon completion of this course, then we should be able to identify ethical considerations when we are handling sensitive mental health data, and also be able to implement data protection measures to ensure the confidentiality and the security of data. And we should be able to examine or rather understand the overview of the legal and regulatory frameworks that are relevant to data governance, and also understand the considerations for obtaining the informed consent and ensuring participant privacy in data acquisition. And finally, we should be able to develop protocols for identifying and verifying mental health data and establishing criteria for selecting appropriate mental health data sources. So basically, when we talk about data ethics, protection, and governance in a context, according to World Health Organization, we have over 450 million individuals suffering from mental health or having mental issues, neurological or behavioral issues. And in this case, the mental illness accounts for like 13% of the worldwide disease burden. And this includes issues of unipolar and bipolar depressions, issues related to alcohol and drug abuse, dementia, and all related issues related to mental health. And in this case, nearly a third of low-income nations in budgetary terms spend less than 1% of their health budget to mental health. So we see that despite the fact that we have significant burden of diseases and that is, over 450 million people mental health issues. And of course, research demonstrated there is partial effective treatments in countries with a disadvantaged health care systems, but we still have gaps of how gaps of knowledge on how to treat most mental health conditions, which are actually compounded with the issues of basic mental health research services. So, and we also see that the several grand challenges in mental health initiative goals need that there's need for focus on local contexts, so that we are able to consider issues of cultural dynamics in the low and income and other dynamics in the low and income, middle income nations' health systems. So in this case, there's been, advocacy for a need for global cooperation in the conduct of research. It's really been emphasized because given the global nature of data, so we need to collaborate. But then the gap that exists is that the local research, and of course, there's an increase in the international sourcing of research indicate a need to enhance the ability to carry out high quality mental health research. How are you going to be able to carry out the high quality mental health research to inform the policies, to improve the service delivery? And that is what data ethics, protection, and governance becomes one of the critical capacities for us to have to be able to execute this goal. So looking at data is in different forms. We can have the numeric data files. We can have the qualitative materials, the interview scripts, whether it is from the key informant interviews, the semi-structured informants, whether it is focus group discussions, all those narrations, storytelling, and the audios, the videos, the images, the geospatial information biometrics. All this is part of data, and data is global. It is everywhere. We interact with it, and it's the basis for decision making, for policies, and which are also geared towards meant to improve the health service delivery, among other benefits. So data is global in nature, and of course, being global in nature, then it has cross-border implications and regulations. And therefore, in most cases, research demonstrates that the regulatory precedents, in this case, is often set by data-rich and data-intensive developed countries. And as much as this is there, also we, as the global nature of data, and then it has potential significant risks and responsibilities. So the question is then, how can data be used in an ethical and responsible way? Okay. So maybe just as to start off, to dive into this section, if we can have just three of us give us one word that comes on my mind when you think about data ethics, and just one word and how you think it's applied to data. If we can have just three of us, maybe you can put it on the chat, or if you can just tell us as we dive in. You have anybody who can give us one word related when you think about ethics, it comes on your mind? Just one word. And I'm not able to see anything on the chat. So just in case there's anything on chat or someone has raised a hand, kindly Joel or my colleague Daniel.
There's some few, there's somebody who said confidentiality, there's law, there's respect, there's privacy from Boniface.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
There's numbers. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Issues of privacy, confidentiality. Thank you. When we think about data ethics, and then there's a lot of words that come into our mind. And of course, it could be a positive word and it could be negative, but it depends on how you use it. So the issues of integrity, violations, the issues of accountability, and we look at this in details later. Responsibility, the consent, we look at how to obtain the consent, the mistakes, the errors that we may deliberately make, and you ask yourself, how can they impact the quality of data that we are collecting, and what does it mean for mental health and research and service delivery, which is a very sensitive area. Honesty, fairness, trust, transparency, morality, and privacy that you were mentioning, all are those keywords that will come into our mind when you think about data ethics. The issues of biasness, how do we eliminate them? Anonymity, or concealing the identity, the security issues, being objective in our research, and of course the protection aspects. The list is endless. So what does it then mean by data ethics? In this case, we are talking about the moral principles and the values that guide the data life cycle. We look at the data life cycle a bit later, but then this is basically the whole process. As a researchers, when we start thinking about planning on how to conduct our research, so the process of planning, getting those ethical approvals, data collection, the analysis, the processing, and the use, the sharing through storage, all those issues to do with storage and deletion. So those are morals and the principles that guide all this data life cycle. So data ethics basically help us to answer questions related to who owns this data that we are collecting, right? And then when we understand the data ownership, then that can also help us to to be able to comply, to understand we need to protect the identity and all that. So we'll be able to interrogate, or rather link them to existing regulatory frameworks. So it will also help us to, answer a question related to how do we obtain the obtain content from data subjects? What are the benefits and the harms of using the data that we are collecting? How do we even ensure fairness, transparency in data practices? And we have different institutions, organizations, whether you are a controller or a processor of the data, then how do we even ensure the balance between the competing interests between with and the stakeholders? Okay, so we look at the issues, the principles of data ethics, and this forms the basis for responsible data management practices. And the key principles that we look at, the transparency, the issues of transparency in data ethics requires very clear communication, you as a researcher. So the data subject surely should understand from the word go, why do you want to collect the data from them? How is it going to be processed? It is a sensitive data. How is it the security of that data going to be, to be ensured? and what is the purpose, what is the use, what are you going to use it. So it has to be very, very transparent, and participants need to make decisions whether therefore they will decide to participate in the research or they will not participate. Okay, remember, it's also their right. The issues of fairness as a key principle of data ethics have to be very equitable in treatment of respondents during the data collection, processing, including use. That is the whole entire chain of the data life cycle, right? Equitable in terms of, considering those contextual factors, the social cultural issues dynamics. In some communities, for example, when you look at the issues of considering the issues of bias, you find that the cultural aspects will actually make them not even report the case. They'll not come up to say that, hey, we have mental issues here in our home and all that. So we'll have a lot of under-reporting. And of course, for fear of stigmatization in the community, so it is very important for us to be fair in how we are handling, to really be keen about the principle of fairness as a principle of data ethics. And how do we also ensure there's the issues of joint designing of research tools? Then this can also help us to be fair in a data representation. So how do we mitigate, and also it will also help us to determine how we can then ask ourselves that how can we mitigate the biasness and promote fairness when we're collecting data. The issues of accountability when you're handling data should be unethically and in compliance with the existing regulations, which you're going to look at. And one, as a researcher, you have to understand your role as a researcher in data management and ensuring mechanisms for oversight, ensuring that it is compliant to the existing mechanisms or regulatory framework so that we are able to ensure confidentiality, the integrity, the quality, the privacy of the data subjects. You have to take responsibility as a researcher or a data processor controller. We have to take responsibility for what happens in case of leaks, to avoid any potential harm to the data subject. So we have to take responsibility and put in place measures that will help to avoid such circumstances. How do we ensure accountability then? We can have issues such as monitoring, audits. When you are doing your research, you can just do monitoring to identify possible gaps and be able to mitigate them. Ensure that there is ethical standards, complying to the laid procedures. Individual agency, ability to make, as researchers or data subjects have the ability, they have a right to make choices about the personal information, participation, issues to do with the information, how the information to be shared and also stored. So you as a researcher, then it is also a responsibility for you to ensure that participants' rights and the link provides to different rights given by the General Data Protection Regulations and of course among other existing regulations, and the well-being are safeguarded. The rights to access the data, the right to know how it's going to be used, the right to benefit from the data after it has been collected and all that. So how do we ensure that? Obtaining the informed consent becomes very important, which should be very clear, stipulating the voluntary participation of the participants, the privacy issues, the ownership, empower them, include them in joint designing of the research tools to make the process and help them to make informed decisions. Data privacy issues this is also very important, and protection from exposure of data to public, observe participants' privacy. And this will also protect the integrity, issues of stigmatization, loss of jobs, maybe benefits, employment related to that. So any personally identifiable information, information linked to participant has to really be protected in mental health research. The challenges, we are handling a lot of data and it's global in nature. So there are challenges, of course, whereby we have cases whereby hackers are able to actually retrieve individuals' information, even just using very little personal information. How to ensure that privacy is safeguarded or ensured? Then adhering to legal frameworks to ensure privacy is very important, so that we avoid possible penalties, right? Then finally, the issue of data quality, it's very important. Ensure that data used for analysis and decision making is very accurate, reliable, and up to date, so that we do not also mislead the policymakers, we do not mislead or end up having malfunctional interventions in health practices. So we look at the ethical considerations in sensitive health data, and sensitive health data, for example, information related to mental health, maybe the reproductive health, issues to do with the drug abuse, maybe the medication and all that. It really requires demands protection against unauthorized access, and of course be able to safeguard the data subjects from possible consequences, right? So ethical considerations, we look at a few of them: the confidentiality, not overemphasize it, the participants sharing the information because they might be trust and expect that the information they're sharing with us researchers is going to be protected. It's not going to be disclosed against their will. Confidentiality in this should actually be made clear in the introductory section when you're obtaining your consent from the data subject, and as laid out in the existing regulatory frameworks. Issues of informed consent, legal and ethical requirement. It is a legal and ethical requirement for us researchers to ensure that we obtain informed consent, particularly in this space of sensitive health data. And also, the data uses should be known when you're obtaining, tell them, as I mentioned before, and then there should be comprehensive consent and written information. In some cases, may have to put it down depending on the sensitivity of the data that you're dealing with. We have to be also very considerate when collecting the informed consent, issues of literacy, so that we are able to accommodate the people. They don't end up being coerced into signing into research that they do not understand. Literacy levels, and once you establish that, then put in place mechanisms that will be able to address this possible issue. The transfer of personal data as an ethical consideration, sensitive health data. So this is the transfer to third parties outside maybe the jurisdiction, outside your country, specific country, even outside the institutions, exchange between the different researchers. So they present legal and ethical considerations, and we have to be aware of that. So this must be in accordance with the informed consent. And of course, you should be able to, as a researchers, to consult the existing relevant regulations on the legitimacy of data transfer within particular jurisdictions. And we need to have data sharing agreements that can be able to help us in place. Anonymity should be able to conceal data subject's identity, increase participants' confidence so that they are even able to become vulnerable and share, for you to be able to collect rich data that will inform policies and our practices in mental health. Then helps research this year helps to make the rich data resources available while safeguarding their privacy, and it's important for open access. Currently, right now, of course, increasingly, we require to make our data is supposed to be to be available, and of course most funders encourage that it is open access. So in this case, how do we ensure that the anonymity of the data participants the subjects actually is protected? Data deletion and storage. Data can only be stored for intended purposes, retained for important purposes, including maybe auditing, and it should be used as such, only for intended purposes. Lack of deletion can lead to misuse and breach and repercussions. So in this case, you have to ensure that there is self-deleting of the data in any backups, whether it's in cloud, third-party service providers, and also ensure that the data that has been shared with partners and third parties has been deleted, unless they can only retain it if there is a legal basis for it, and if there is, of course, an agreement to that effect. So we come into the issues of data governance, looked at the data ethics. What is data governance? In this case, the data ethics were the principles and values guiding the data lifecycle. And in this case, then it is a process that ensures that data that is collected data is actually secured, it is private, it is usable when needed, searchable, and accurately reliably accessible. Okay, how do we ensure this? By putting in place governance ensures, like, we have to put in place the principles, the procedures, the policies, the frameworks that ensure acceptable and responsible processing of data through data lifecycle stages, including deletion. That is very also important. So data governance therefore helps us to maintain the integrity of the data, the quality of the data, its availability, accessibility, usability, and security, and define the data ownership, and other responsibility related to it. It also ensures that we are compliant with existing data laws or regulations within our different jurisdictions and, of course, the global ones. So it is entrenched in existing regulations and ethical principles, but also included policies and interpretations within specific projects. You will be attached on a specific project. So there are regulations that are governing data management practices. It also begins to adherence with us adhering to the regulations governing the data management practices. And the international data governance encompasses both standards and practices for ensuring that the data that we have is actually fair, principles of fair, that is findable, accessible, interoperable, and also reusable, and also ensures that the ethical principles, the policies and regulations, recommendations for processing and sharing the data and the use within and also across the borders. Why do we even have to be concerned about data governance? It enhances decision making, and in its case, decision making based on high quality data. Because when you put in place regulations, ensure that we are complying to data collection, obtaining consent, and complying to the existing regulations, then we're able to obtain data that is actually accurate, that is reliable, that can help to make decisions. And then mitigate potential risks and costs with growth in data volumes. We evolving technologies coming in. So it will help us to avoid possible litigations issues should we have our data being mishandled. Improve the quality. We cannot overemphasize that. The efficiency in issues of reducing the duplication and waste created by information silos, and of course, saving the cost for researchers, for funders, for different institutions. Data governance is also very important to facilitate sharing, integration, and exchange of data because it defines the protocol for us to share. We need to have data sharing agreements. And of course, it enhances collaboration, local collaborations, global collaborations, and whatnot. Data governance measures, such as the requiring data validation, the verification and standardization, will help to prevent errors, mistakes, the inconsistencies, the discrepancies, thus ensures that the data that we are collecting is actually reliable. And of course, the findings can inform policies and, of course, the interventions in the space. The principles of data governance, briefly, this brings in the human's rights lens and equity to the use of data within and across health systems, including research. And it also informs and strengthens governance models, the regulations, the standards, all the instruments that exist and across countries, within regions, towards a shared vision of equitable health data governance. Another principle, the data governance is a tool that supports the use of digital technologies, the AIs, and data for the health and well-being of all. And therefore, it's a very important critical step towards global framework for health data governance. Principles of data governance, they recognize and they build on existing norms, on the principle, the treaties and conventions and guidelines that exist, which include, we have World Health Organization data principles. There's a framework for data governance for WHO and their guidance on the ethics and governance for AI, artificial intelligence for health, and of course, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development recommendation on health data governance, and the Universal Declaration of Human Health. So the principles, I'll mention principles, they're anchored on three broad objectives. They protect, one of the objectives to protect, ensure that you're protecting the health people, protect people, promote health value, and prioritize the equity. So in this case, when you're looking at protecting the individuals and communities against harm and evaluations on every stage of data life cycle, what are we talking about? We're just ensuring that there is risk assessment so that we are able to risk assessment in the data life cycle, stage of data collection, data processing, to be able to identify any potential gaps and be able to seal them. And also, then we have issues of participation so that the issues are actually, their needs are also incorporated. Building trust in data systems and practices. And here we have to develop data governance systems in a participatory and a transparent manner. And of course, ensure the accessibility of the regulations that we have, that the data subjects can be able to access, they actually understand, they can be able to know what is happening in a data work. Then it should be very responsive in this case, whereby we're able to respond to the questions being raised by data subjects. Why are we going to use the data for personal information for, and be able to also put mechanism in place to address the existing, any possible grievances. Okay. Then the ensuring the data security, talked about it, just throughout the data life cycle again, and this should be continuous, and also particularly as we see that there is technology and dynamics, population growth, the need for increased data research and all that for research, and therefore it becomes very important. When we talk about promoting health, enhancing health systems and services, then this should be done in a manner that is actually supporting equity and human rights. And we have different data subjects have different human rights, the dignity and privacy and all that. And then when we are also talk of issues of innovative use of promoting data and sharing interoperability, and also innovative use of the data. So, and when we talk about facilitating the innovative use of health data, then the technology issues also comes in to ensure that it is key for sustainable development goals. How do we ensure universal health coverage? So that has to be very important. When you are looking at the equity, promoting equitable benefits from the health, have to make sure that ensure that there is equitable representation of all data subjects, regardless of the socioeconomic factors. They have to be able to benefit from the research that you are collecting, and also include them through public engagement and include other stakeholders in this particular place. And then establish data ownership, data rights and ownership, so that we're able to protect them and ensure the safety, and also their right also to benefit equitably is also important, and include productive and includes the productiveness and services from the different data. So their rights, they have to know, they have to understand, and they have to benefit and also be able to control what happens to their data. Okay. So we look at the data ethics and governance, the linkages between data ethics and governance briefly. So data ethics provides the foundation for defining what is right or wrong in using data, that is confidentiality, while on the other hand, the governance will help us to provide the framework for implementing those particular ethical principles in practice, the policies, the audits, through policies, established policies, audits, and access control. Data ethics informs the design of data governance policies and standards. And in this case, for example, if we need privacy for data subject, may lead to policies that ensure the same. While data governance, of course, ensures compliance with ethical norms. The other examples are related to data ownership. Data ethics will require that individuals have ownership over their personal information, but then governance ensures that you have frameworks for obtaining the consent from data subjects before data use or collection. The quality, we require complete, accurate, relevant, and timely and consistent, then establishes way for ensuring measures that actually ensures that we have data quality. Data security, again, individuals have a right to privacy, set up measures that ensure the privacy is actually assured. Okay. Then finally, on data transparency, data ethics will require that we have data practices that are clear, accountable, and auditable. And what will data governance do? Ensure that we have mechanisms for documenting, reporting, and reviewing data activities. So briefly, we look into data protection before we move to data life cycles. So data protection, of course, it's central in research for research ethics and human rights, and very important in terms of being the autonomy, independence, and human dignity, protecting the data subjects, their dignity. And it's an ethical and legal obligation for researchers to protect participants through data life cycle. So data protection is the process of safeguarding important information from corruption, from compromise or loss, and providing the capability to restore the data to a functional state and should it be rendered inaccessible or unusable. Data availability, when needed and usable for its intended purposes, it's one of the key role for data protection. So we protect it to ensure that it's available and it can be used for intended purposes, preservation, deletion, and destruction. So just to make it available, that is one of the important aspects of data protection. Data protection spans three broad categories. We have the traditional data protection, that is backup, restoring the copies and preventing the loss, the damages. And then the issues to do with data security, protects the integrity of data itself against manipulations, malware attacks, the phishing attacks where people will be impersonating and, seeking information. So both internal and external threats, issues when you have weak passwords and all that are likely to expose the data subjects' personal information to misuse. And then the other category is the data privacy, controlling access by researchers, organizations, anyone comes across it to ensure confidentiality, integrity, and privacy of data subjects. So data protection and assures these are the processes and technologies that are used to protect. In this case, the processes and technologies that are used to protect and secure data mechanisms. These can be considered a mechanisms to achieve the goal of continually availability, immutability of the critical data that we in the mental health research. We are evolving, technology is evolving, and therefore renders data highly susceptible to interception, surveillance, corruption, and loss. And therefore, we need, as researchers, to be able to identify appropriate study methods and data processing instruments to ensure organizational and technical measures to ensure that data security is actually protected. How do we ensure data security of the data subject then in this case? Okay. So we briefly look at how to ensure we protect health data. And this will ensure confidentiality, privacy, and ethical treatment of research participants. The issues to do with the informed consent is very important. Let them consent to the research. The anonymization, conceal the identity so they can also share more, okay, and protect them. And even if unauthorized access, event that we have unauthorized access to personal data, then if it is anonymized, you can use pseudonyms, you can use letters that at least they are not linked to directly to the data subject, so it protects them. The training, as researchers will have research assistants and all that, and we need to, in this health space, sensitive area, then we have to ensure that even the people helping us with data research are actually trained about the existing policies. That means we need to ensure we understand the regulations, we understand the issues, the potential repercussions of not denying the data subjects their rights. So we need to train them on different protocols, the privacy issues, and the best practices to be able to mitigate the risks and ensure compliance. Data minimization, that is also how we can protect health data. Only collect what is required to answer the research objectives. This reduces the possibility of data misuse, the breaches, and minimize the privacy risks. Okay. Issues to do with the storage. Where are you going to collect? You've collected data. Where are you going to store it? So have to look at is it electronic? Is it through electronically stored in electronic gadgets? Are they portable? Where are you going to put them? So this will help to prevent the breaches and the loss. Then data encryption. This should be both in transit when you're exchanging the data between researchers, between organization, locally, globally, regionally, and all that, and also when it's just at rest, being consumed locally. We have to ensure that it's encrypted, okay? And then we restrict access to controls, only even the authorized personnel, and based on the roles and responsibilities. So data governance will help us to identify those roles and define the roles and responsibility, and we can now define who accesses what data and for what purposes and why. Data retention policies, very important. Researchers, we need to understand if we're working attached to projects, then we need to have data retention period, because the laws will require specific period of retaining particular sensitive data or personal data. Monitoring and auditing, cannot overemphasize that, so we can be able to identify any gaps in data collection, data processing, and be able to ensure that we are compliant with the data protection regulations. Guidelines, and how do we do this then? When we talk about guidelines for, we talk about guidelines for ensuring data sharing. And in this case, efficient sharing personal data is growingly being needed by funders. You realize that World Health Organization, the new policy requires that data has to be shared. The National Institute of Health, Wellcome Trust, Belinda and Melinda Gates, those are just examples. High impact journals. I recently submitted an article and they were actually asking for data availability. I think previously I had not seen that in some other cases. So that is very important in mental health research. So, there's a Research Council of the United Kingdom says that publicly funded research data is a public good produced in public interest, should be available with restrictions as possible in a timely and responsible manner. How do we navigate data sharing requirements? this data sharing requirement while ensuring the protection of personal data? That's a key question, right? So we look at the data sharing, the guidelines for data sharing as stipulated in the General Data Protection Regulations. So before we even share the data, and then you have to issue, there are questions of legitimacy. First of all, you have to ask yourself, why are we sharing this data? Is it lawful? Is it anchored on existing? Does the existing regulations controlling or upon which the research is actually anchored on allow the sharing that data? Is that data supposed to be shared in the first place? Did you obtain the consent? What is the aim? Are you justified? What and how much data do we want to share? With whom are we sharing? Is data sharing proportionate? Right? Those are the key questions that we look upon when you're sharing data, the issues to do with the legitimacy. The right to share the information, as a researcher, have to ask yourself, which organization, and different organization, of course, will hold different powers. Maybe it is a funder or, and and then also have to ask issues of, consider issues of data nature, the confidentiality. Can we share? To what extent can we share some confidential data? Sometimes it will be like a legal requirement, maybe in the interest of data subject to protect them. But so it has to be, there are regulations that have to look at, define, understand what data we're sharing. Then you also have to look at the benefits versus the risk of sharing the data. Very important when you're sharing data. So, and also of not sharing or not sharing that data. High risk to the rights and the freedoms of data subjects. So data protection of, or also data protection or privacy impact assessment will be required in such a case to be able to, to determine what are the benefits and the risk of sharing that particular data. Consider where the data transfer is between, or is it outside one's country or jurisdiction. For example, the European Economic Area, is transfer covered by adequacy decisions that safeguards individuals' rights and freedoms? That's a key question you need to ask when you're sharing data. Then what to do if there is no adequacy for decision for you to transfer the data? Do other safeguards, e.g. the binding organization rules, govern the transfer? Those are key questions you need to ask ourselves. Then do we have any particular exceptions covering the data transfer if no adequacy in decision and no appropriate safeguards, e.g. a contract with the individual or public interest legal requirement? Very important question. Finally, on guidelines for data sharing, develop data sharing protocols, very important, and agreements. If it's research institution, different collaborating different cities, then you need to have a data sharing agreement and what to share, how much are you sharing, the frequency, the purpose, the security, inscription, how is it going to be ensured, the deletion, the retention period, all need to be stipulated. Then keep up to date data, and accurate has to be up to date. And how to ensure this? Whose responsibility will that be? How do we ensure that data subjects access the data, and the retention period? And what about the deletion processes to ensure privacy, confidentiality, integrity of data subjects? Why do we protect data? There's the issues of data accuracy and reliability. Yeah, just to make sure that the data that is available, it is accurate, is up to date, and can be relayed to make decisions. Protection of personal information to safeguard them from potential risks or consequences, stigmatization, loss of jobs, benefits related to that, social isolation, preserving individual autonomy. It's a very fundamental right, and you see that it's existing in the existing legal frameworks locally and globally. Then the issues to do with trust and confidence, when they know that their data is actually will be safe and will be protected, and then can be vulnerable and share more to help inform decisions. The regulatory and legal compliance to ensure that we have to protect the data subjects' personal information to ensure that we are compliant to the existing regulations. It is also an ethical protection. Data is for you to actually protect data participants' personal information. Data-driven innovation, we protect it. Actually, it can drive innovation. Come up with technologies can be able to help benefit not only the data subjects but also the others in the same space. Use of data for public benefit and social good. So we protect it for the local and global local and global good in mental health research. Finally, we look at the principles, or briefly look at the principles of data protection, and these ones are anchored from the data protection General Data Protection Regulation, Article 5, we have different countries. We see that specifics that have different acts for data protection. And including like in Kenya, had the Constitution of Kenya is also part of provides a right to privacy, and also in different other countries. So one of the principles looking at it requires that data subjects, as research, we have to ensure that the data is actually processed lawfully, fairly, and in a transparent manner. We also have to make sure that purposive limitation data is only collected for specific purposes, and are the data subjects aware that you're collecting that particular data? Are they consented to that? Data minimization, again, it has to be adequate, it has to be relevant and very necessary for you to collect that particular data. Accuracy issues, complete, correct, and should be up to date. The storage retention periods have to be defined, and integrity and confidentiality. Then the security mechanisms, different security mechanisms have to be put in place to ensure that data is actually protected. Accountability, we have to ensure compliance to the existing principles and regulations, know what they are, and so you are able to implement them. So briefly look at the data privacy laws and regulations. And these are about collection, use, and sharing personal information to third parties without notice or consent. And the data privacy laws and regulations vary from one country to another. And we see that 137 out of 197 countries on the globally has data privacy and legislations. In Africa and Asia, only have 61%, 57% of countries. That was as at 2020 when I got this information, having adopted such legislations. So in least developed countries, we only have 48% of the that have actually the legislations for data protection. The link there, at your time to share this material, will take you to an interactive map where you see that some countries that have these legislations in place. So some of the key regulations with significant implications for data privacy, protection and privacy, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that was in 1948, started way back. So the Article 12, and I quote, "No one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with privacy, family, home, or correspondence, nor to attacks upon his honor and reputation. Everyone has the right to the protection of the law against such interference or attacks." Okay, that's one important regulation that has a global consequences in terms of data privacy and data privacy. Then the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, also key. Its council adopted the guidelines on trans-border data flows and the protection of privacy, and recommended them to the OECD member countries. The other ones are actually the very key one and very recent one, and the General Data Protection Regulation. And, basically, of course, it is protects the European Union citizen and personal data and privacy. But of course, the real data is global in nature, and due to its extraterritorial applicability, and then it has an implication on an organization, processors, and all of us that are dealing with research, processing any European Union residents' personal data. And so we have to ensure compliance regardless of. And then the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. It is a U.S. federal law that safeguards privacy and security of patients. That is the medical information, but also has global implications. Consumer Privacy Act, which protects the privacy.
Hello, Lilian.
Business obligations around collection and yes, time.
Yeah, no, it's not time. I think there's a problem with the network. So, yes, I can hear you, but we lost you a few minutes ago. So probably maybe you can switch off your video. I think it will improve.
Is my video on?
Yeah.
Fine, then let me stop sharing. Then I switch off. Sorry for that. Okay. Fine. Let me just. So can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see.
Okay. So we are winding up on the data privacy laws and regulations before we come to live data cycle. So, and for the Africans' data privacy laws and regulation ecosystems, this is actually underdeveloped or desperate. We still have very few countries that have data privacy and regulations, okay? And for African, for data privacy and all that, we actually influenced by international frameworks, particularly the General Data Protection Regulation. And of course, it requires that the controllers, data controllers and data processors, as researchers, all of us, we need to require to ensure stringent standards to protect the personal data that we are handling, okay? So on the continent, some of the frameworks at the continental level and regional levels, we have the African Union Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection, but there are some debates around it because up to date is not yet been effected or consented upon by the other countries. Just a few, about 15 out of 55 countries, okay? The Malabo, it's also known as the Malabo Convention. The SADC Model Law and Data Protection, also, we have the ECOWAS Supplementary Act, and we have the East Africa Framework for cyber laws. Then on the continent, yes, I've mentioned that only about 29 out of 55 countries have data privacy and data protection and privacy legislations. That is by July 2020. And in this case, a highlight of this one is country level data privacy laws and regulations landscape. Countries with legislations, for example, just to name a few, we have Kenya, and starting with the Constitution of Kenya 2010 has defines privacy as a fundamental right. Then we also have Data Protection Act 2019. South Africa has also Protection of Personal Information Act 2013. Other countries that have legislations, the Uganda, Angola, and then most of West Africa countries. The countries that have no specific data law includes Tanzania, Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe, not limited though. And then we have countries that have no any data privacy laws and regulations, but the constitution guarantee of privacy. These are Ethiopia, Namibia, Sierra Leone, and also Gambia falls in that category. Then countries with the data protection laws present, no any data protection laws present. South Sudan and Somalia, DRC Congo, Sudan, and Mozambique falls in that category. Please note that the data privacy laws and regulations ensure that, ensures and enforces the strict guidelines of data lifecycle, collecting, use, processing, deletion, and all that, sharing and storage throughout, And then they also establish different offices like the Data Protection Commission officer who ensures that the regulations are actually researchers, institutions, all comply to the existing regulations. And of course, in this case, the issues of penalties and when they come in place, where there is no compliance to this. So reflections on the question, then this we can discuss, we can think about it maybe. How will a researcher institution collecting data through digital intake forms ensure the data collection practices align with both local and international regulations? We can reflect about that. We can discuss it later. And assuming that you have personal data on a group of women who are part of your research that ended in 2010, the personal data is stored in a pseudonymized manner. You wish to conduct a follow-up study with these women in the future. Can you continue to hold on this personal data? That's something that we can also reflect about. So thank you very much. We'll interact later. Let me invite my colleague to take up from here. Oh, maybe I'll stop sharing, then he can share from his side. I hope we are together and I stop sharing.
Yes, thank you very much, Lilian.
Okay, thank you.
Daniel?
Right, so please confirm if once you see my screen.
Yes, we can see your screen, thank you.
And you were seeing it on slideshow?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, and thanks Lilian for that first session and laying the foundation really on issues of data protection and data and ethics and data governance, which is really crucial. And this is timely because it's at this stage in time where a lot of conversation actually is ongoing around how we protect data, because many countries are continuing to legislate, coming up with data protection laws. The information that we have on the slides may actually be not current, because there may be a lot more developments that have come in. Yeah, so for example, if we say the countries that have data protection laws, there may be another country that actually, came up with the data protection law as soon as yesterday. Very recently, the East African community started actually talking about having a data governance framework for health in East Africa. And that is a conversation that's ongoing within the East Africa Legislative Assembly. So as you realize, this is a very timely topic that we all need to consider and discuss, and nobody may be an expert on this specifically. All have a contribution to make, and we welcome all your suggestions. So we'll have enough time at the end of this session to just have a conversation around this topic. Now, I want us to take a journey. So, of course, we have all these laws. We have digital technology. Actually, I consider the two major things, of course, there are many other things, but the two main things that are driving or shaping how we look at data, how we discuss data, how we manage data, how we look at data, because now it's not business as usual. We cannot look at data the way we used to 20 years ago. Things have changed. The two things that are driving this conversation actually is, one, very fast moving or digital technology, AI, machine learning, all ChatGPT, all these things that are ongoing in our current generation, and the data protection laws that are being enacted, currently in Africa. So those two things are really driving how we look at data. In the previous slide, Lilian talked about, the UK Council says that all publicly funded research data have to be publicly available. But we have a law that says you have to make sure data is protected. There are laws about localization, there are laws about personal data, and says that you have to anonymize data. But another question comes, how do you ensure that actually the data is anonymized? So all those conversations, we need to have them. So as I said, I want us to have a journey, just as a brief journey. This journey, I call it the data life cycle. Now think about data and think about the processes it goes through. So we are all believers that data is a public good, and that we have to manage this data in a responsible way throughout the stages it goes. And so if you consider this data as a commodity that is moving from one stage to another, that is what I'm calling the data life cycle. Think about the movement of this data. First of all, you think about this data before you even collect it. Before you go to the field, you're already thinking about the data. So it starts at the stage where you conceptualize your study. You're thinking about a proposal, a research proposal, you submit, you get the funding, and then you start now thinking about how to go to the field to collect this data. The process that you do at that stage, as you're thinking about this very precious commodity, are what? Think about that. And then there are things, of course, now you have conceptualized your study, you are now ready to go to collect the data. Now you are in that process of training the research assistants or data collectors or field interviewers. You are in that process and you are collecting the data. That is the stage now you are actually in the field collecting this data. What processes or what things that you need to put in place to comply with all these things that we are talking about, data protection laws, and the ethics and all those that we have discussed. Now, the data is being collected in the field. You have your research assistants, assuming you have trained them, and you have trained them on different things. You have trained them on ethics. You have trained them on the data integrity. You have trained them on how to use the data collection tools. You have trained them on how to ask or administer the questionnaires. You have also ensured that they have a common understanding. So to ensure consistency, you have done all that. Now the data is in the hands okay, you are in the field. So what are these processes now that you put in place in the field? So we're talking about issues of consent, because you cannot collect data before you get consent from the research participants. Now, assuming you have the data, the participant has consented to participate in the study, and you have asked the questions, you have the data. It's in the hands of the data collector who you have hired or you have recruited for your study. Now, what are the processes that you make sure that there is no breach of the issues that Sarah talked about earlier, issues of privacy, issues of confidentiality? What processes do you put in place to ensure that happens? Now, data has to be, because it's in the hands of the field interviewers, there's also the aspect of this data have to move. Now, we are talking about digital technology right now. Actually, 20 years ago, people, or 95, I can even say 99% of the people in Africa, or let's say, be modest, 95% of people in Africa could have been using paper-based data collection tools. Aspects of, or let's say 15, 20 years ago. Now, a few years ago, issues of electronic data capture started coming in. And we talked about ODK, Open Data Kit, Survey CTO, COBO, and now it's a common practice. Many people right now use electronic data capture tools to collect their data. Now, data is in the hands of the interviewer. How does this data move from the field to your servers? And these servers could be locally housed, or they could be in the clouds, in a cloud somewhere. And where is that cloud? Think about those things. The data transmission process from the field, to the data manager who is sitting somewhere behind a computer looking at the data. I saw a question in the chat earlier about social media. Now, currently, we do a lot of WhatsApp and other social media platforms. In fact, it's very common practice to manage field processes or field procedures through a common WhatsApp group that's created, where all the research assistants are in, and they can be able to share their reports, how they went in the field, and the processes. How do you ensure that that interaction in the WhatsApp group does not result to breach of privacy of the research participants? Because there is a potential possibility that somebody may share some personal data, personally identifiable information of a research participant in the WhatsApp group. How do you ensure protection and privacy of such information? How do you transmit? There are actually, it's very common practice now in many instances that WhatsApp, if you want to share a document, just share through a WhatsApp, through WhatsApp. You can just post it on WhatsApp and everybody will see it. How do you ensure that these documents do not have, or do not result to breach of privacy? Now, the data has arrived, assuming it has arrived to the data manager. I am looking at this data behind my computer, and there are people who are interested in this data. So of course, I may be asked, can you share this information with me? So that, and that person may not be within the research study, or they may not be a member of the study. How do you ensure that the data sharing process, the data processing procedures, by the data people, how do we ensure that we are applying the standards, we're applying the, all those things? So that is all. I'm describing basically how data governance fits in the whole data lifecycle. We have data managers and we have data analysts. They share data amongst themselves. But there are some collaboration also that many studies actually do not happen, for example, in our center, many studies happen across Africa, and we have collaborators across the world. There are collaborators in the UK, collaborators in the US, and Asia, and everywhere. And the collaborators could be participating in the research process in between. They are conducting analysis, they are conducting data management, data cleaning. How do we collaborate when we have a law that's saying data has to be localized? How do we share data amongst ourselves as researchers in this collaboration? So now it brings in questions around data sharing agreements, data, the data sharing policies or agreements or MOUs between institutions. Now, after the data, there was a question about how long do you keep data after you've, after after you finish your research study. Of course, that's another conversation, but it also you have to think about, you know, the embargo period by the institution. You have to talk about the delay, setting aside the data that is personal data or from the anonymized data or the identified data. I'll be talking about that in the next slides. I just bring the difference between data anonymization and data de-identification. Now, I've talked about the data distribution. This data have to be stored somewhere, you know, through some repositories or some archiving frameworks within the institution or even in a consortium. How do you manage this process? Now, after you've finished the life cycle, I mean, that first process, the data can also be reused. The data original purpose has already been done and the data has been stored, you know, somewhere. But a student, a postgraduate student in a university requests this data for their master's or PhD thesis. How do you ensure, you know, that use of this data, secondary data now, does not again result to breach of privacy and the data sharing laws that potentially it was agreed upon earlier? So that is the life cycle of the data, and you realize that it's really important that everybody has are on the same page regarding how we navigate these issues. Now, let's start with the first stage. This is the pre-data collection period. So what are things that are that you always need to put in place? Now, these are just pointers, but they may not be exhaustive. They may not be exhaustive. One is that you have to define your data needs. So prior to your data collection, define the specific data requirements that aligns with the organization objectives and the research questions you have, because this will help and guide even when you are developing your data sharing agreements or data sharing policies, if you're working in a consortium and so on. Planning. Now, there is a very important practice. We normally call it best data management practices. One of the things in best data management practice is development of data management plans and standard operating procedures. But it goes beyond that, ensuring that people in the study are actually complying or adhering to the standard operating procedures that are developed. This is a very important practice, but in practice, sometimes it's not commonly used, done, especially for research studies that are, you know, fast-paced. Our study has been, you know, awarded for 1 year, you know. So the process of developing data management plan and the SOPs, it sometimes may take time. It requires approvals. It requires different versions. So that time may not be sufficient. But what can we do? It's important, but what can you do? So it is therefore necessary that even if the study is short, even if it's few months, 6 months, there needs to be some guiding principles or guidelines that is telling everybody involved in the team that these are the standards we are going to apply, and everybody has to adhere to it. And there has to be somebody who is ensuring that that happens. Now, before collecting data, this happens, of course, you know, when you have just obtained and you're planning to now go to collect data, you have to do, you know, apply for the ethical review approval, you know, from IRBs. And that approval process outlines several things, which I think I'll be mentioning earlier, and I think Sarah also mentioned. I'll be mentioning a bit later. Issues of ethics, you know, issues of consent. How are you exactly going to ensure consent? And consent is not only consent for those ones who know how to read and write. There may be other people or participants or research participants in your study who may not know how to read and write. How do you take care of their needs? How do you take care of the minors? You know, issues of assent. How do you take care of the vulnerables? You know, especially when now you're talking about mental health. You know, how do you ensure, because mental health is a very sensitive topic, you know, sometimes it may have stigma. How do you ensure that this happens? So all this happens before you actually go to collect data. So you, as a researcher, members of a study, Remember, even students, because I know in the audience we have also students, and you'll be doing your, those who are already doing their masters or PhDs, and you have to, of course, apply for all these ethics and NACOSTI and all that, and approvals. You have to think about these things before actually going to collect data. And this one will help you, because when you go ahead and ignore some of these things, it may come to haunt you later, and there are actually very stiff penalties. Remember recently, the Kenya Data Protection Office actually fined very huge sums of money to some three entities that there was some breach of privacy. So it's very important. Now, all this happens, but also you have to make sure that the people working in your team are sensitized and trained, and therefore it actually puts a lot of emphasis on the training, because sometimes trainings may be rushed, but time has come that we have to really pay a lot of attention to the training that happens to the research teams before they actually go to collect the data in the field, because many of the breach of privacy may happen at that stage. Now, we've talked about pre-data collection period. Let's see what happens now when you're in the field. In my first slide there, I was just asking questions. Now, what do you do? So I talked about the standard operating procedure. So this is the time when you actually need to make sure that the standard operating procedures are adhered to. The teams must be oriented on the standard operating procedures, the content, and allow them to ask questions, for clarity, ensuring that you routinely check and those spot checks and data quality assurance to ensure that these are adhered to. A good practice in data management is that when data is being collected, that you manage this data in real time. As the data comes, that there's somebody dedicated looking at this data in real time. And there are many technologies now that are available to help actually make this process easier. Because we are doing electronic data capture right now. We are using ODK, very common. We are using, Survey CTO. We are using RedCap. We are using all these, very good electronic data capture tools, and they have application programming interfaces. And right now, there's a lot of growth in data science. And so it's important to utilize, and these are opportunities that technology brings. It is important to utilize these technologies to make our data processes easier and more efficient. Automating reports, and there are tools actually right now that you can use to automate reports so that people can be interacting with this data in real time as they come. Now, why this is important is because you can be able to capture any issues early. Can you imagine capturing an issue 5 months later? Maybe it's a gross research misconduct issue, fraud. Maybe it's a data privacy breach, and you only realize that 5 months later. And maybe the research participant realizes that, and they report you to the data protection office. The penalties may be huge. You can be able to capture errors, data errors and inconsistencies. Data governance is not only about privacy. It's also about the quality of the data we get, because it is streamlining the process to make data available for decision-making or for policy, for evidence-informed decision-making. And we need to use quality data. We need to use real-time data. We need to use latest evidence to be able to make such policy decisions. And therefore, utilizing these modern tools is actually very important. The visualization platforms, dashboards that you can utilize, and everybody in the research team can be able to see the data as it comes, and you can be able to detect if there are any issues in real time. I talked about standardization, so and consistency, maintaining consistent data collection methods across all the sources, ensuring compatibility and reliability for future use, And there is now a lot of conversation around open science and transparency in research. And all this comes with, of course, the journals and the funders actually are advocating for open access data and open science. And all this goes along with reproducible research, ensuring that the evidence or the paper, the data that you report can be reproducible in real time. If somebody uses the same data with the same code, with the same, processes, they should be able to get same results. But there are instances where you have published paper, but when you apply the same methods they used on the same data, you get different results. How do we make sure this happens? This standardization needs to start at the point of collecting data. It's not only at the time of analysis. And so ensuring that we have consistent data collection tools or instruments, questionnaires, if the data are if the study design is longitudinal, where you're collecting data at multiple time points on the same individuals, then a question called sex, and this, a variable is called sex, and it's coded 1, 2, for 1 to mean male and 2 female. 2 months later, when you're going for the follow-up, the same question needs to be coded exactly the same way and coded exactly the same way. That is for consistency, because sometimes you may lose information when you have inconsistent methods. Metadata creation. Now, metadata, just to define metadata here, this is information about data. In simple terms, it is data about data. So it's important and this is important because it is describing the data. It's information that describes the data, because when you have a data set that has 1,000 records, you may just need maybe a page that is describing some information about this data. And so there's a lot of conversation right now, actually, in the data science space around metadata that is machine readable and also human readable. And so there's a lot of conversation. So ensuring that this documentation happens in practice and in real time. Now, just to stay a little bit more on the data collection, there are different methods of collecting data. Just want to highlight a few. I will not go into the details. Of course, this can be another course. Just want to highlight a few of the methods that we use in collecting data. And they majorly categorize into 3 main categories. One is that they're observation, just sitting somewhere and observing trends and observing and recording in a checklist or something. So that's observation. But there are also experiments. Experiments could be trials, and we'll be talking about that in the next slide. There are also surveys. And surveys is the most common, where you go to a certain target area or population, administer a questionnaire on a group of people who have been sampled from the entire population. Or there could be also census. Census is also a part of survey, where you collect information from the entire group of people or subjects in the population. The data collection approaches also can vary from different forms. One and the most common is using interviews where it's administered by someone. There's a respondent who is answering the questions, but there's somebody who is asking the questions. And this can be both qualitative and quantitative. Quantitative, this is where you are collecting numerical information or quantitative information. And qualitative is where you are moderating a conversation, maybe through a focus group discussion or key informant interview. So as I said, these different methods can be handled in actually a different class, a long class, but this just to mention, just to highlight them. And there could be also self-administered surveys. After COVID-19, it taught us a lesson that actually it's possible to collect data online, and right now there's a lot of forms, even from from social functions. You just have a Google form, and people are collecting this data. I'm mentioning this because you'll see, as I'll be mentioning in the next slides, how do you ensure protection? How do you ensure that the data that is administered online through a Google form or through SurveyMonkey. And some of these Google Forms, as you may have seen them, is that they ask you to enter your name, and they may ask you some information there, and they make it restricted that you have to enter before you proceed. In fact, there are some that you have to collect your email address. And email address can be regarded as personal data, because it may tell where, if it's a work email address, it may tell where you work, and it may also tell your name. So how do you ensure that these data are protected? And sometimes they are restricted. You have to enter some information before you proceed. Checklists that are used mostly during observations. So somebody is sitting somewhere and entering a checklist, but there's also some very sensitive information that are collected, and this could be biological sample collection methods, that are used. So these are just some of the approaches that are commonly used. Now, direct observation. So this is where a researcher or an observer just sits somewhere or watches and listens to the study participants, mostly to observe some behavior, and they are mostly used in ethnographic studies, and also in other research activities. Actually, you just sit and observe behavior and observe how things are done. Sometimes they can be used when you are doing an assessment of something. For example, you are assessing, the monitoring and evaluation system. You are just going to check how people document their data, how people, and it may be used together with other methods of data collection, including questionnaires and so on. But observation is a very common practice that's done. So there are two major types. One is called overt, and the other one is called covert. Overt is where the research participant being observed is aware that there's somebody who is observing me. And this one is mostly those of us who went through, at least I can speak from the Kenyan system of education. When for somebody who is doing education as their study, you do what we call teaching practice or attachment. And in your attachment or practice, somebody will come, that's an assessor, your examiner, will come and sit somewhere at the back of the class and just observe how you're teaching. You are aware, the observer is there, they are marking something on their notebook, they are just observing how you are teaching. So that's overt. But covert is also another type of observation where the participant does not know that they are being observed. So most of the time, it elicits the truest kind of behavior, because it gets a person or a participant in their most natural, state. So they don't know that they're being observed, because if you know that you're being observed, obviously it may influence how you behave. Now, observational studies involves observing individuals' behavior. I talked about this already. So it can provide insights around patterns of behavior, but also a question that we need to ask ourselves is, how do ethical considerations play in these observational studies? So as you design your study, depending on the type of study design and the methods that you choose to use to collect your data and to capture your information, the question that should always be in the mind, because 5-10 years from now, this will be a really, really important topic. How do you ensure that data of these participants are protected and that this participants' privacy is ensured? Now, in clinical trials and in other research, of course, there are most often clinical trials, we use experiments, So for example, an example which is very, an example that I think is very very recent is when we were developing the COVID-19 vaccine. Maybe this is, and you may think about any new drug, you take some participants and give them the new drug that you're testing, but some participants, you have them as a control, so that you can, at the end of the study, you can compare, did the new drug work, or it works, or it didn't work, like it's just exactly the same as the people who did not receive the new drug. So that is an experiment where a researcher manipulates a variable under study and tests the outcomes at the end of the study. So this mostly happens in a laboratory setting, in a controlled environment, so to speak. And the choice of this, and the choice on the location of this experiment, of course, relies on the scope and the research questions of your study. And there are many other types of experiments. Of course, there's the randomized control trials that is at the highest level. And then we have other types of experiments like quasi-experimental designs that we may not have the time to discuss at this stage. But the question that you always need to think about as we discuss this is, how do you ensure that the data and the participants are protected, and that you are adhering to the required ethical practices and the data protection laws, and that you are not breaching any privacy of the participants? Issues about benefits and harms, I'll mention that as I'll be discussing the concept. Surveys. These are one of the most common methods of data collection. It involves administering standardized questionnaires or scales, and will be, and when I mention scales here, in the mental health space, we're talking about PHQ, patient health questionnaire tools, PHQ-9, PHQ-702. We have GAD tool for anxiety, and all these tools that are used to measure different mental health conditions. They are mostly administered in a survey, because you have some participants and then you ask them to rate or to tell you about how their experiences were. For example, for PHQ-9, how their experiences were in the past 2 weeks, in the past 14 days. How have they been feeling about, how their mental health situation, when you're talking about different mental health conditions. So that is most of the time, it's administered in a survey. So there's a questionnaire for that tool that's administered by somebody asking the questions, and then the respondent asks. Also, there are participants, or there are some situations where this can be self-administered. I have answered this before, where a questionnaire is sent to my email, and then I am asked to to read the question and enter the response that fits, my truest response, considering maybe the past 2 weeks in the case of PHQ-9. So this kind of method, it provides information about experiences, perceptions, prevalence, risk factors, and treatment preferences, because it's an interaction, and I can be thinking about what I like and my opinions, my perceptions. Can be conducted in person, I said, where you have an interviewer and an interviewee kind of conversation. You can be conducted over the phone. I remember during COVID-19, where there were so many restrictions about in-person interactions, we had to, researchers across the world actually, we had to change how we collect data. And so we decided, we started collecting data over the phone, design the questionnaire, and then have a database of participants. You call the participant gives you the the answers over the phone. There's no physical interaction. So that also happens. Online is where you have, a questionnaire sent on email or through other means. But this type of questions mostly suffer from what we call bias, because it relies on self-reports. It's me who is reporting as a respondent, so it may have response bias. A response bias here can be issues around non-response, where you've sent 10 questionnaires, but only 5 come. How do you use that? Only so that means 50% response rate. So how do you handle issues of missing data and non-response in that case? So there's also social desirability bias. I will answer depending on how I think that my answer will result to something good for me. For example, if it's a service, I will not answer in a way that will make me not to get a service. There's that possibility in surveys. So how do you manage those kind of biases that happen? So there's a link here that you can read more about this. But the bigger question in this context is, how do you ensure data is protected, the integrity, ethics, privacy, and all those things that we are discussing about data governance and data privacy are adhered to. So, data acquisition and integrity. Integrity and quality in data acquisition. So very important, and I alluded to this earlier in my earlier slides, that it's very important to have clear data collection procedures, consistent, and standardized across all the data sources. If you're having different time points for longitudinal data, ensure that they are standardized and you have thoroughly thought through, and all your teams are actually in line with that. And the data collectors are trained and adequately trained. So many times, it's also important to even do data quality assessment before even collecting the data. From the pilot study that you conduct before the actual data collection, just conducting some quality assessment and consistency assessments to just ensure that these data collectors have a common understanding. I have had an experience before where you have a question, 70% of the interviewers have understood your question in a certain way, and they are administering the questions to the respondents in that way. But 30% of your interviewers have understood the question in a totally different way, and they administer the questions that way. And especially when you're talking about mental health. For example, PHQ, where you have a question about looking back at the last 14 days, have you felt, in this way? And there are several questions there. And then people do not have a common understanding about when do you say mild, when do you say moderate, when do you say severe? When you don't have that, kind of alignment or consistency, that there may be a problem when you're analyzing your data at the end, because you have 14 days. So between 0 to 7 days, 7 to 14 days. What about if somebody who says none? None, does none mean 0? Does none mean 0 and 1 day? Does it mean 0, 1, 2 days? People may have different understandings about that. So you need to really make sure that the trainings are really adequate and thorough, so that and do some tests to ensure that they have a common understanding about that. Develop and validate your data collection tools to ensure reliability and validity. I think that goes without saying. I've mentioned that quite often. Standard entry procedures to minimize errors and inconsistencies. And of course, we are looking at electronic data capture tools here. When we have said that we are all submitting data at the end of the day or immediately after you collect the data, and then that is the common understanding amongst your teams. And it's important to monitor the data collection process. And that is why it's important to have at least somebody who is like a team leader, who is just overseeing the process in the field, and as a liaison person between the people collecting the data and the people who are receiving the data in the office. It's important to have this kind of layers of quality check, because it helps to capture issues early. And it's not only about data quality. Here we're talking about issues of adherence to data protection law, adherence to the standard operating procedures, adherence to the ethical considerations that you signed up to. In fact, right now, many IRBs, they actually have a form that you have to sign called data protection agreement, that everybody has to sign, everybody who is within the data, who is handling the data, as you submit your protocol. From the principal investigator all the way down, you have to sign that form called data protection agreement, or non-disclosure agreement, so to speak. How do you ensure that this actually happens? Because it's one thing to sign, is another thing to actually do it. So there needs to be somebody who is ensuring that happens. Monitor this process, monitor compliance. And there's a link here again that you can look at to read more about that. Now, we've talked about ethical considerations, and I would like to bring in a new issue here, which, and you'll forgive me, I have seen this actually breached quite often, especially for academic work, master students collecting data. This issue of informed consent actually is very important. So what is informed consent? Informed consent, just to define it, is a legal process that brings the researcher and the participant to a conversation. And this conversation helps and mark the word there, informed. You are informing the research participant about your study with the intention to not coerce them, with the intention to ask them for voluntary participation. You're asking them, this is the study we are conducting. You have been selected because they fit the criteria, and you are asking them to participate in this study. You are telling them about the benefits. You are openly telling them about any risks that may be associated with the study. You are telling them how you are going to handle their data, issues of confidentiality and privacy. You are telling them how the data will be used. You are even giving your address, your contact information there. You are telling them that this study has been approved by a certain, IRB, Institutional Review Board, or Ethics Review Committee. You are basically describing the entire study and the process that you have gone through and what will happen after, and asking them to participate. Now, their participation is voluntary. It's voluntary because they can decide to participate or not. And when they decide not to participate, if that study is tied to some service provision, especially or services, in the government or something, that their decline to participate should not in any way interfere with their continued receiving of the service that they receive. So it's a conversation, and that conversation needs not to be rushed. It needs to be to the extent that the participant has understood about the informed consent. It's informed consent. So you are informing, and then you are asking them for their consent, and they may decide to consent or not. And so this consenting in the digital world, sometimes it may happen electronically, and there's electronic way you can sign the consent forms. But traditionally or conventionally, the informed consent, actually, there is a paper that is done in duplicate, where after you have explained everything, the participant will have to append their signature in both documents. You keep one copy of the document, and the other copy remains with the participant, so that they can continue reading. And they can change their participation. They can decide to participate in the first wave of the study, and in the second wave, they decide not to. It's all voluntary. And that one has to be very clear to them. And the ethics considerations or practices actually says that we need to do that. Now, what do you do when you are doing this? So you have to, when you're conducting a study, avoid or minimize anything that will cause physical or emotional harm to the participants. Remain neutral and unbiased so that you don't coerce your participants to participate in the study, because you don't want your preconceptions or opinions to interfere with their decision-making process to participate in the study. And also, even in the way the study goes, your opinions or your preconceptions, they need to be neutral, because you want to get the information from the study. So respect people's time. If possible, you can compensate them for their time, and the compensation ways actually can be discussed. Of course, there are ethical review committees that actually require you to tell or say, if you are going to give them some money for their time, how much exactly are you going to give? So that's also very important to put there, and how and whether that money is not going to coerce the participants to participate, because participation is voluntary. Be sure to protect the data you collect, but how? And this is where I think in the next kind of trainings we need to be focusing on is exactly the how. When we say protect, and the lawyer will say make sure you pseudonymize, you anonymize. But exactly how? How does it exactly work? Practically, when you have the data, how does it exactly work? So that is what we need to be focusing on. Of course, it's important to be aware that there is now data protection offices that are keenly following, and they're actually, slowly by slowly getting very strong to follow these things. I already talked about informed consent. It's a process. It's not just a document. And the goal is to ensure that the participant understands the risks associated and the benefits of the study and their rights as a participant. It's a communication. It discloses that it needs communication discourse that respects individuals' autonomy and builds trust. So there's some information here that you can download and look at about informed consent. Yeah, I think I've already talked about this, So obtaining informed consent from patients participating in clinical research is an important legal and ethical process, for researchers. And there's all these links that you can look at. Now, at what stage do we say that informed consent has happened? It will be complete only once the following four things have happened. One is that you have disclosed information and you give the participant time for them to, interact with you and understand if they have any questions, for information disclosure, transparently and openly. They ask questions, you respond. If you don't have the right answer, you can refer and you can ask. You can actually even call the research leads, so that you give the participant the right information. The participant also needs to understand, ensure that they have understood. We are conducting a research study right now that one of the things that happens actually is that after we've conducted the informed consent process, we administer an assessment test to ensure that they have understood the content of the information. It's a clinical trial, so we just want to make sure that they understand the issues that we have mentioned in the informed consent. So we administer that test 3 times. They have to pass a certain mark. There are 15 questions, so 15 marks. Actually, there are 18 questions, and they have to pass 15. They have to get a mark of 15 in all the 3 tests, so that they can be able to proceed to the study. And the study is an ongoing study. So that is one thing you can do, that can happen, just ensuring that the participant has understood. I'm not saying that is the way it's done in all the studies, but just ensuring that the participant has understood about the consent. It's important. Of course, when you're explaining, you are describing and also ensuring that you're competent to conduct the study, but the participant has to only participate voluntarily. And that is why all research, there's normally no payment for participation. You don't pay a participant to participate in a research study. It's voluntary. Whatever monetary things that are given to the participant are actually called compensation. They are just compensating them maybe for their time, or if they have incurred costs for transport or movement from where they were to where the study was being conducted. So you can reimburse that to the study, to the participant. Now, all that we have discussed is during data collection. All this happens when people are in the field collecting the data. Now, and remember, we are in a journey. Just don't lose me. We are in a journey of a data life cycle. So we are looking at what happens to the data and the process around it throughout the journey. So we are almost there. We're almost reaching our destination. Just a few more slides. Data transmission. So you have the data. The participant has given you the consent. How do you get this data to be used, to be processed, to be analyzed, so that it can then be used for policy making? And there are 4 things here that I have mentioned. One is that you have to use secure channels. Secure channels here, I started by talking about issues of technology. WhatsApp, social media, how do you ensure that data you use the secure channels are used when transmitting the data, because somebody can just post the data set to me on my WhatsApp. My WhatsApp, may not be that secure. It may be secure to me, but I'm not so sure if maybe some other people may access my WhatsApp. How do you ensure that happens? So you always make sure that you use only secure channels for transmitting this data, and this can be synchronizing, because we collect data electronically now. So you submit the data using the electronic gadgets, sometimes encrypted, and the data systems developers, actually, there are a lot of advances around encrypting data when being transmitted from one level to another, so that to prevent any unauthorized access or interceptions, and maintaining some data integrity. I was in an institution actually before that. Actually, it prohibited sharing data on email. So that's also another consideration. Is email secure? So it may depend. It may be or it may not be. So those are conversations that need to happen. Data integrity. When you're transmitting data, implement measures to validate data accuracy and integrity during transmission. So this one will obviously help you to minimize the risk of corruption or loss. Data transmission timelines. When you have collected the data, is in your tablet as a field interviewer, and then it stays in the tablet, and you're moving with that tablet from the field to your house, and maybe it's a weekend. You have gone to, you have gone to a social function, and maybe there is a temptation to use the tablet because it is, it can have maybe good camera. You use the tablet for camera, taking the the photos in the social function, and the data is also somewhere in the tablet. These photos, your friends also want to see the photos that you have taken, and they borrow your tablet. Already the tablet now is in an authorized hand. How do you ensure that unauthorized hand that has the tablet and has very sensitive mental health data in the tablet, that they don't have access to that? Because one, the tablet may disappear, it may break down, and there may be so many things that may be associated with that device that you're using to collect the data, and you may end up losing the data. Can you imagine? You have invested $1 million to collect data, and then that data gets lost because data were not transmitted in a timely fashion. Those are things that may, these kind of standards and practices and processes and data governance measures are put in place to minimize loss that may happen in such a way. Keep track of daily submissions. And this one also, of course, helps to ensure that when I know that 20 interviews were conducted on, in a mental health study, in a day, that in the server, I have 20. If in the event that 20 were collected in the field, but I only have 15, then I need to ask myself, where are the other 5? And so there needs to be that kind of daily check of these transmissions. Right, so the data have come. So of course, the data management plan, it's important. We talked about this for clinical trials, and for clinical trials, it's important to do good clinical practice tests, and actually some ethics require that you do that for clinical trials. Standard operating procedures for the different things, for data entry, for data transmission. So those are 2 different standard operating procedures. There could be also standard operating procedures around how to collect laboratory information, how to handle samples in the case of if you are collecting blood samples, then how do you manage that? How do you make sure that there's linkage, good linkage and data linkage between different sources of data? It's very important. So validation of the data, check all data for errors, completeness, and consistency. This is important because it helps to capture any issues before analysis, so that you use very accurate data for analysis, and it will give us quality evidence. There's also a process called data documentation. I think it's coming up in the next slide, but I've talked about anonymization, and I want to differentiate here between anonymization and de-identification. So what is commonly done is de-identification. So de-identification is where you remove what we call personal information, personal identifiable information. This could be names, could be things that can be used to identify an individual in a data set. So those ones are stripped, but the data set still has a link, has another variable that can be linked back to the personal data, So you have a de-identified data set, doesn't have personal identifiable information, but it has an ID, let's say PID, a personal ID, a pseudonym, that is unique to every individual. So that's the identified. But anonymized data is where you have a data set that you cannot, given that data set itself, you cannot in any way link back the information in that data set to any individual person. That is the data set that's okay to be shared openly, like in an open access kind of framework. Anonymized data. And so it's important to always have this kind of anonymization techniques trained to the people handling the data. And there are so many right now advanced anonymization techniques, which I may not have the time to discuss because it may take time. I just mentioned a few. So there's one that is very common called K-anonymity. K-anonymization technique. And that is the most common actually that is used right now to ensure that the data is anonymized. And the reason why it has to be fully anonymized and actually conduct sensitivity analysis to ensure it's anonymized and there's no information that is lost is because there are studies that have shown that actually it is possible to still identify people or individuals through variables that are not what we call personal identifiable information. A variable like sex and age and date of birth. So this, if you just have them, you may not really know this date of birth belongs to who. But there are some advances actually in AI that are actually making it possible to still re-identify people using these kind of variables that are not traditionally known as personal identifiable information. In fact, they are now called quasi-identifiable data, quasi-identifiable variables or information. And in my next slide, I'm going to show you some report that actually was found several years ago. I think I've already talked about this. Audit trails, ensuring that you maintain a very good record of the data processing steps, transparency and accountability steps, so that you have very documented way. If you change a variable from 10 to 20, what informed that change, so that in case that was an error, then we can still be able to go back to the original data set. Now, this is the report. In 2000, the US census was conducted, United States census was conducted, and there's somebody who conducted a privacy study called Sweeney, and it was published in the, I think, Carnegie Mellon University, data privacy paper. Now, take note of the area that I've highlighted in yellow. It was found that 87% of the individuals in the United States had reported information like, zip code, it can be the address, sex or the gender, and the date of birth. Now, this study found that with this information, the address, the zip code, the gender, and the date of birth, actually enabled this researcher to uniquely identify 87% of the individuals in the United States. Now, if you just add another variable, maybe we can call it, just look for another variable and to add to this. So there's no name, there's no GPS there, it's just quasi-identifiable information. If we added another variable, I think you could actually identify way more participants. And this actually brought the conversation around this quasi-identifiable information and coming up with more advanced anonymization techniques like the K anonymization technique. So I talked about data documentation. So of course, after you've collected your data, you have your data you've analyzed, you've anonymized, and all this. It's important to have a documentation of this data because we are talking about reuse. We are talking about use and reuse of data. We are talking about repurposing of data. We're talking about sharing this data openly. When you have a data set that has 10 variables, X, Y, Z, without information telling us what X is and what Y is, what Z is, that data may not be useful. And so data sets that are shared openly for secondary use, they must be accompanied by very clear documentation of this data. Now, the documentation involves several things. One is documenting the processes that happened, sharing the study protocol, metadata, which is both human and machine readable, data dictionaries and code books, just to describe the different variables and the levels of measurement for the different variables. If you have sex coded 1, 2 or coded 1, 0, yes, no, coded 1, 2 or coded 1, 0. So it has to be clear. If it is longitudinal, then it's consistent. Which questions were introduced where, which questions were dropped where, which questions were consistent. All that documentation needs to happen. And if you need to upload this data to a public repository, then you also have to adhere to the data sharing policies for that institution and also for the country. And it's also very important. So we make sure the data are anonymized completely before sharing it to a public repository. So this is key component for data reusability. I talked about and reproducibility of findings, because like, for example, many journals now, I remember like PLOS, I think you have to, when you submit a paper, you have to submit together with the data that are used to generate the findings in that paper. Now, for data reuse and for decision making, so the key thing really is that you need to use quality data for analysis so that you have quality evidence for decision making. Leverage data insights to make informed decisions that are grounded on empirical evidence and mostly latest evidence as much as possible. And leverage on the available data science technologies now that we have, visual analytics that will make data to be available in a format that is more understood, in a format that is easy to use, interactive format, that somebody who is interacting with this data doesn't have to read a 30-page report. They can just look at, very, very snapshots of key evidence or key findings, in a visual format. And that will make the use of evidence faster. It will make the use of evidence easier. And ensure that and there are so many: Power BI, Tableau, R-Shiny for the people who use Python. There are many ways that you can actually use these modern tools. Use data that is structured. Ensure the data is structured and documented according to the FAIR principles. Lilian already introduced what FAIR is: data that are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. so that it enables its easier discovery and reuse by others. Now, we're talking about storage. And of course, the question that we may be asking ourselves now is data localization. So there's data that needs to, there are data protection laws that actually say that data cannot leave, the country. But of course, it's focusing more on the personal data. Of course, personal data cannot leave the country. But if data is anonymized, so the question is, can that data be shared outside the country? So it's important to think about all these things and write them down in a data sharing agreement or data sharing policies that are associated to the study. Select appropriate storage solutions based on the data volume, accessibility needs, and long-term preservation considerations adhering to the data privacy laws. Of course, in compliance with data protection and privacy laws. Archiving strategies, implement archiving strategies to ensure data remains accessible and usable over time, complying with retention requirements. So there are countries that may have very strict restrictions around how long the data should be kept. But of course, right now I think there's some clarity around data that can be kept and data that cannot be kept for how many years. As long as the data are anonymized and you have anonymized data and personal data, separately, then the personal data you can delete it, and after how long, so they are lost, and maybe we can discuss that. Yeah, so I think that is that. But before we finish, I have 3 questions. And these questions, I would like you to just think about this and type it in the chat. Type your answer in the chat. The question I'm asking overall discussion point is, as I started, I said there are 2 things that are driving how we look at data in currently: data privacy laws or data protection laws and digital evolution, the AI and all this digital technology. Those majorly, there are many things, but majorly those 2 things are driving how we look at data. So the first question I'm asking is, what opportunities do digital technology and privacy laws bring regarding availability and sharing of data in Africa? Now, we can focus this to mental health, but you can also look at the data in general in Africa. What opportunities do you see going forward? I've mentioned some of them, but if you think about any, please just point it in the chat and we discuss. So the second one is, now it's very related to this one, is what challenges? The first one was on the opportunities, but the second one is, what challenges do you see? And then thirdly is, what ways or how can we navigate these challenges? What are the ideas and ways, solutions that we can navigate these challenges as we chart the way for better data sharing in Africa for mental health? Up to there, ladies and gentlemen, I have finished. The next slides are just references, which we will share. Please go through them. But I just want to stay here for the next 3-4 minutes to just see your interactions in the chats about these questions that I have asked here. What opportunities do you see that digital technology brings, and privacy laws and this, data protection regulations? What opportunities do they bring around data sharing? What challenges do those 2 things bring around data sharing? And how do we navigate those challenges? Right. I think I will stop here and hand it over back just to see the questions. You can think about them and please drop them as we continue with the next set of questions or question and answer. Back to you, Joel.
Thank you.
Yeah, or Diana.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, Daniel and Lilian, for the wonderful presentation. Maybe just to check the Q&A session, we can have. I know some of the questions that had been asked before by some participants have been answered in the second session by Daniel, but I'll address some that maybe I missed, and maybe you can kindly answer them. So one is asking if you can share 15 questions form that you use when checking whether participants understood informed consent. So that one is addressed to you, Daniel. So I don't know if you want to mention if there are questions that should be checked, should be used to check whether the participants understand the informed consent.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks, Joel. So the questions that I'm referring to, of course, they are contextualized to the research study and the content of the informed consent that we are using in our research study. But of course, this can be contextualized for any research. Of course, you are just looking at each section of the consent form because there's a section for the overview of the study. There's a section for the benefits and risks. There's a section for the confidentiality and privacy. There's a section on why the participant has been invited to participate. All those sections, we just generate a few questions. Yes, no, yes, no. It doesn't have to be all 15, but I think I'll discuss with my team and see whether those ones can be shared because they are very contextual for our study. I may not give a clear, a firm answer right now, but we'll get back on this. Yeah.
Thank you. I hope they got the question. So there is another question by Patrick. How is informed consent addressed for covert studies?
Lilian, please join me to answer some of the questions.
Yes.
Yeah, but I can take a go at that. Covert and overt studies and how informed consent. So, for example, a participant doesn't know that they are being observed. That's a very good question. They don't know that they're being observed, and so you're collecting information. But of course, at that stage, before that study is approved by the IRB, you have to, of course, explain how you're going to address issue of, participant agreeing to participate in the study. But especially if you're not going to collect their names, you're not going to say anything that is that's tied to their individual person, but you're just observing maybe a community, observing an area, you're observing how a certain group of people behave in a certain in maybe based on your research questions. So it's a complex thing. I'm not really sure I have an answer to that right now, but maybe Sarah, you can try that.
Yes, just to add on that, yes, it's complex, but also importantly, that really the process of even the ethical approval, it has really to be very, very clear and be approved by the ethical committees. They should really be aware about that. And of course, making sure that the identification and all that, there are subjects or participants' identities actually concealed. So it's a very fragile area, but you must have approval from ethical regulations in that case. And that means that there will be a justification for why you have to do that. If is it in the public interest, is it in the interest of the data subjects and all that, something that will have legal implications. So really that have to clearance from the ethical review boards for the different countries.
Thank you very much for addressing that. And there is another question that is, I think this one is being addressed to Daniel, to speak about cookies available in the websites, and the relation to data accessibility and protection. Yes, over to you. Can I repeat again the question?
Yeah. Oh, yes. The issues of the cookies. I think that also it's a very sensitive issue. Of course, we are dealing with having used a laptop, for example, a computer, and you're leaving this information there. So, but also want to believe that the website owners, for example, or the owners of those particular softwares really are have to be very compliant to the existing regulations to make sure that we should be able to define, how are they going to ensure that the privacy and any information that is related is actually protected. So the issues of privacy and all that, literally, even the owners of those websites have to take care of that. But now, Daniel, unless you want to add something that is closely maybe related, if it's related to your research that you're using. But of course, ensuring that data clearance and all that is, clearing the clouds and all that, and has to be done. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So I don't know if I missed the question. It was, and maybe I captured it from your response, Lilian. Sarah, on was it the cookies that is on the internet sometimes? Is that the question?
Yes. The cookies available in the websites.
All right. Yeah. So
Yes.
most of the time, actually, and maybe I'll pose this back to the audience that and everyone actually, every site and almost every if you browse any site, there's always a privacy kind of document that is attached to that website or to that browser, or where there's a privacy document that mostly they will refer you to read. But often is the practice that people don't read, just click yes, so that because it may not have the time to read. And even those cookies and those things, there's normally an option that you're given, whether you accept or not accept. And before you accept, there is information that is given there, including how long this whatever they collect, they are going to keep it, and for what reason, and all that. So they normally put that just to guide you to make a decision whether you want to accept or not to accept. And of course, we are working in a very, very an environment where these data privacy laws are becoming more discussed, and people are becoming more aware, and therefore, it's active. So suggestions and improvements are ongoing regarding how the information they collect about us, even when we don't know, are kept safe by these websites.
Yes. Sorry, Daniel. Sorry, not Daniel, Joel. That's actually a very interesting aspect, because you will ask yourself, like many a times you come across accept cookies. How even keen are we always to reject or consider? How do we even take time to read the policies attached and all that? Most of the time, I think it also, as researchers, we really have to be prudent. We have to be very vigilant, and just to ensure the security as much as possible. And I see Zedi Misiga has some reflections about the same. Joel, can Zedi be able to speak?
Yes.
Maybe we can also
Yes.
benefit from his comments. Thank you.
Let me.
Zedi.
Okay, just a moment. Diana, can you be able to unmute?
For Zedi Misinga?
Yes, please.
Yes, I've already done that. So Zedi, you can unmute yourself and probably share.
Are we speaking about the cookies? Must have lost you for a minute.
Yes, Zaidi.
Yes. Okay. What was that? I was just mentioning that most times corporate research is done in public interest, and therefore this would be in public spaces. Like at times when we are having different conferences, we assume that the event is public, and therefore when you become part of it, then definitely you subscribe to also be sort of like observed or something. On the issue of cookies, I just also wanted to mention that the DPA 2019, that is for Kenya, has made it mandatory if you are conducting any kind of study, or if your website has cookies, then of course you have to put up the privacy notices. And it's also been identified as an high-risk data set to get together with others like genetic data, biometric data. Also, if you're doing large-scale profiling, and this is normally most common in marketing websites, and also there are innovative technologies like AI where your information could also be fixed without your consent, and therefore the Data Protection Act is really trying to take care of this to ensure that organizations are staying compliant. And in terms of research, before undertaking the research activity, if you have any data that is considered as high-risk data set, then it's required that you table a report at least 60 days before you roll out. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Zaidi.
Yes, Joel, back to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So there was a question about, I think you addressed that, Daniel, some time back, on how long the data should be kept. And also maybe you can answer together with this, that how long should a participant hold on to the consent before signing or accepting to sign, maybe?
I will answer the second one. I want to defer the first one to Lilian, just to hear her first reaction to that, or to Sarah. How long a participant should stay with the consent form before making a decision? Is that the question, right, Joel?
So, sorry, yeah. How long the participant should keep the consent before signing? Like maybe you give the participant a consent to sign and you're waiting for the response. Yeah.
Of course, as a researcher, you have to exercise patience. And to me, research is a conversation, especially when you're collecting data. It's a conversation between yourself and the research participant. So by the time you are having, that kind of conversation around consent, you're building a rapport. You are telling them about the study, so that they get the interest. So that they get the interest to participate in the study. Sometimes, yes, I agree that there's a participant who may hold on to the consent form. They are not telling you yes or no. They are just there. They are not making a decision. They are not signing. So as a researcher, you don't know how to proceed. Of course, you can ask them to. They have the right to take their time before they make the decision to participate in the study. And some of them may want to consult to maybe a trusted person to them to help them make that decision whether to participate. If it's a young person, they may want to consult their parents. If it's a student, they may want to consult maybe the school to see whether. Just give them the time so that they can make their decision. Sometimes you may reschedule the interview. So tell them, if you're taking time, of course you can tell me when you are ready, then excuse yourself, continue to the next research participant, so they can think about and read the consent as long as they want before they sign or before they make that decision. That's how I would look at it, Joel.
Mm-hmm. Joel, thank you. Maybe just to add on that, also, yes, how long should they hold on the consent? And then also, it's also important as a researchers, we literally then have to also ask ourselves, why are they taking long to consent? Is it that maybe they did not understand? Perhaps those are the questions we can, that reflect. You can check with ourselves, ask ourselves, did they not understand? Is it in the language that they do understand? And where are they hesitant? Is there something that they are not sure about how their information is going to be used and all that? And then, of course, importantly, the period will also be defined by what is the reason, the purpose of the study. Perhaps you are also tied to a timelines, to a project, to a funder, to all that. So there's also that particular period. And then if they don't consent, of course, you do not force them. You have reason. That's still a reason on its own. Then you can move on. Yeah.
Okay, I think
there was the first question.
Mm-hmm.
Lilian, there was the first question. I wanted to hear your thoughts on
retention.
this. Data retention. Yeah.
On data retention, what I can say on the data retention, I think what was the question was about if there is no policy for data retention, if I recall that right. Yes, of course, you need to define for research. If it's not a project, then if there's no data retention period, clearly have to consult with that. You'll be safer consulting with the relevant authorities, the relevant authority, so that you do not fall into a victim of breach. Because remember, the ethical considerations also, you really cannot keep data for so long. Like, you just have to keep it if there's a reason. So you just have to consult with the relevant office if there's no policy regarding the retention. That is what I'll say. Yeah.
okay. I think the rest of the questions we will try to put them in the Q&A section in the website. Since I know time is not on our side, so maybe our facilitators, do you have something else to add before we finish?
Yeah, just before we get there, Joel, there are people who have their hands up. Just wanted to make sure maybe they have something to say.
Oh yes, we have. Yes, we have Joshua. Diana, could you help us unmute?
Yes, you can unmute Joshua and ask your question. I've allowed you.
Also unmute. Yes, thank you.
Okay, if Joshua is not ready, perhaps Clifford or Dwarf.
Yeah, thank you. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, yes. So thank you for the great insights from the presentation. I've really learned a lot from the presentations. My question is, I needed clarification on, is there a difference between what we call a data governance policy and a data management plan? Because I've seen this being used interchangeably in many organizations where they talk of a data governance policy, and we also have a data management plan. Are there any distinct difference between these two documents to say?
Yeah. Thanks, Clifford. I can go first. Yeah. So they are two related. But data management plan, I will look at it as a document that is so specific to a certain research activity. So, for example, if your organization has 20 research activities or research projects, each of those research projects can have their own data management plans. And the reason is because their research questions are different, their methodologies are different. There could be others that are more qualitative, others are more quantitative. There are others that are clinical trials, there are others that are just observational studies. And so each research project has a data management plan, but a data governance framework or document or a policy is at organizational level. A document that outlines the different practices or processes for everything that happens with the data, from the time you get it to when you collect to when you share, and talks about the data sharing activities, the ownership of the data, the data sharing models that you use or approaches that are used, and it's at an organization level. So all research projects kind of adhere to that data governance plan, data governance policy, but they can have their individual data management plans. A data management plan can be a 3-4 page to whatever number, it can be even 20-30 pages. But a data governance framework is a more robust and comprehensive document that outlines all the processes, and it includes issues about ICT, issues of publications. All those things are covered under that data governance framework. I don't know whether I've answered your question, Clifford.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for clarifying that, because I've seen people interchanging these two terms, and thank you for that clarification.
Thanks.
Okay, perhaps we can take one more from Patrick Kalundu. Patrick, are you there? Okay. There's Omar. Omar, are you there? Okay. Charlotte.
Hello,
Charlotte,
can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the presentation. It was so rich and insight. I have two questions. I have two worries. And the very first question is in terms of data harmony. During the presentation, you talked about data harmony in terms of methodology. So my question is, do we have a framework or guidelines for to come about with this data harmonization? And does the framework consist of the method? Does it take into consideration the methodology for data collection? That's my first worry. And the second question is, what is the major difference between data governance and GCP? Because I am kind of conflicting. What's the difference between GCP and data governance? Thank you.
All right. Sarah, please chime in anytime. But I can actually start with the first one on the data harmonization. So when you talk about data harmonization or standardization, really, of course, I explained, and your question is on the whether there's a guideline or methodology on this. So there's a team actually and there's even a working group actually right now working around creating vocabularies, and data standardizations, and all that. So that is from the data science space. They are working on this, but the context that I talked about, standardization or harmonization, is to ensure consistency of tools in, and you can look at it from the organization level and even to the research project level itself. So if you have a longitudinal study, and the longitudinal study has different stages or have different time points, and you have the same questionnaire administered at different time points. I have seen situations where you have a question that was asked in time point 1, in time point 2 that question was changed, or a new level of measurement was introduced. If it has only 3 levels at the first stage, in the second stage, another 3rd level was introduced, and maybe a question was changed, or things like that. So it brings all that inconsistency. And if you have different people managing this data at different time points, you have 10 time points, you have very inconsistent levels. So it brings an issue, and issues of data management, issues of data cleaning, and so the context that I talked about this is to at the forefront to ensure that you have a consistent way of looking at your data collection instruments, so that you have a standard practice and these are adhered to by all your data collection teams. But in the larger scheme of things, it's also important to have standard practice. I'll give an example. At an institution X, you have data collected on by different research activities or research projects, but they're collecting the same variables. Let's take an example. Socio-demographic characteristics, age, sex, education level, the levels are normally the same. So as an institution, we can adopt one standard and say we will always be collecting, we'll always be labeling sex as 1 for male and 2 for female, and that is consistent across. We will be labeling yes, no as 1, 0. That's consistent for all. We'll be labeling other specify as other specify as 77. We'll be labeling don't know or non-response as 96. So that kind of standard that is adhered to by all data systems that are being developed within the institution, because it helps for data linkages and things like that. Okay, I think I went to other things, but I hope I answered your question. The second question was on difference between data governance and GCP, good clinical practice. So yeah, they're different because good clinical practice is mostly for clinical studies, and it's a requirement that you have to do good clinical practice tests and pass the good clinical practice before you participate or lead or conduct a clinical study. And this good clinical practice, of course, it's very, very, very similar in terms of the things that the standards that are put there, the process that are put there. But data governance, just the way I explained earlier when I was responding to Clifford, is more robust and looks at the processes for all research activities happening within the institution.
Mm.
Yeah, Sarah, go ahead.
No, thank you. Yeah, I agree with you. Governance is it's more holistic. Yeah, the GCP can actually be a subset of governance. So governance provide that procedure that ensures that it puts in the policies, the frameworks to ensure compliance, or things are done according to in compliance to regulations. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel and Lilian. I think this was quite an interactive session. I've seen so many questions, and I think due to time, we might not be able to answer all the questions, but for sure, I'll take all the questions and share with our facilitators. And when they have answered all the questions, I'll share on email.